If you're new here, welcome. This channel is a place where ordinary lives collide with extraordinary choices and where family stories often hide the deepest heartbreaks. If you find yourself drawn into this tale, consider subscribing because somewhere in these words, you might recognize a piece of your own family. My daughter sold my wedding ring to pay for her husband's dream. That's not just a title. It's the truth I wish I had never lived through. The wedding ring had been the only thing left of my husband after cancer took him from me. He was a quiet man, a police officer who believed that the smallest things carried the biggest weight. On our wedding day, he slipped the ring onto my finger and whispered, "This is not gold, it's a promise." For 40 years, I never took it off. Even after he passed, even when the loneliness grew too heavy, that ring reminded me that I had once been chosen, cherished, loved in the purest way. It was more than jewelry. It was the anchor that kept me from drifting too far away. So when I opened the little velvet box one evening, the one I kept tucked inside my dresser drawer, I expected that quiet glimmer of comfort to greet me, like it always did. Instead, I found nothing but an empty dent in the fabric where the ring used to rest. At first, I thought maybe I had been careless. Maybe I'd left it by the sink after washing my hands. Maybe it had slipped under a sweater in the laundry. My mind ran through all the harmless explanations because it's easier to blame forgetfulness than betrayal. But then my phone buzzed. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize. The words were short, almost businesslike. Gold band vintage setting, appraised at $4 200. Confirm sale? Attached was a photo, my ring, my husband's promise. In that moment, my chest tightened the way it does when you're underwater too long. The room around me tilted, the air became sharp, and all I could think was, how did the most sacred piece of my life end up in a pawnshop's inbox? I pressed the phone to my chest and sat on the edge of my bed, unable to breathe. Somewhere inside the house, my daughter and her husband were laughing at a YouTube video, the sound muffled by walls that suddenly felt paper thin. And just like that, I knew. Happiness is fragile. It doesn't shatter all at once. It cracks quietly, the way porcelain does when dropped on a carpet, invisible until it splits in two. That night, the first crack appeared in mine. I confronted my daughter the next morning, holding the message on my phone as though it were a smoking gun. She glanced at it quickly, then looked away, her cheeks coloring just enough to betray the truth. "It must be a mistake, Mom," she said, almost too fast. "Maybe someone hacked your account, or maybe the jeweler confused it with another ring." Her voice was syrupy, the way children speak when they're trying to soothe you while hiding the burn behind their back. I wanted to believe her. God help me, I wanted to believe her so badly. But then her husband entered the kitchen. Brandon, confident, charming, with that salesman's smile that had once won her heart and my suspicion. He saw the phone in my hand and slid into the conversation with the ease of someone used to putting out fires. "Mrs. Walsh," he said smoothly, pouring himself coffee as if nothing in the world were wrong, "you really shouldn't stress yourself over little things. We've been under pressure lately, working on something big. It's a startup, the kind that can change lives, but it requires sacrifice." He leaned across the counter, his eyes gleaming with a kind of hungry certainty. "Think of it as an investment in the future. Your daughter and I were building something worth far more than any old piece of jewelry." Any old piece of jewelry. I wanted to scream that it wasn't jewelry. It was my husband's hand still wrapped around mine after death. But the words stuck in my throat. My daughter reached for my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Mom, please understand, we didn't mean to hurt you. Brandon's idea, it could give us freedom. No more living paycheck to paycheck. No more watching bills pile up. This is our chance to finally breathe." Her eyes were pleading, desperate, full of a faith that reminded me of the little girl who once held my hand on her first day of school. Except now she was clinging to a dream I couldn't see, led by a man whose smile felt like a mask. I looked from her face to his. She all hope, he all calculation. And in that moment, the ring wasn't the only thing I realized I had lost. I tried to sleep that night, but the thought of my ring being passed across some pawnshop counter kept circling in my head. My husband's promise, reduced to a line item on a ledger. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brandon's face, confident and unbothered, as if he had every right to take what was not his. The next morning, I decided I needed answers. Not explanations, not excuses, answers. Brandon had mentioned the word startup like it was a golden ticket, so I sat down at my old computer and typed in the name of his company. What I found unsettled me. A glossy website full of bold promises, revolutionizing the future of finance. Stock photos of smiling people in suits, jargon-heavy paragraphs about blockchain, liquidity pools, and exponential growth. But beneath the surface, there was nothing. No real address, no registered office, no employees listed. Only a P.O. box in a strip mall an hour away. I felt a chill work its way down my spine. I printed what I could, the pages warm and thin in my trembling hands. Then I called an old friend, Helen, who once worked in banking. Over the hum of her office, she lowered her voice. Margaret, this looks bad. These kinds of companies pop up all the time. They're shells. Sometimes they're scams, sometimes they're fronts for things far worse. Like what? I asked. Money laundering, criminal networks, people moving dirty money around so it looks clean. Her words landed like stones in my chest. That evening, I sat quietly at the dinner table while my daughter and Brandon talked about seed funding and early investors. I watched him cut into his steak, each slice neat and deliberate, like he was carving away the truth. My daughter nodded along, tired but devoted, clinging to his every word. And all I could think was, this wasn't just about a ring anymore. It was about a web being spun around my child, and she couldn't even see it. Somewhere deep down, I realized the fight ahead wouldn't just be about getting back what was mine. It would be about saving her from him, from the lies, from the shadows gathering behind this so-called dream. I drove to the address listed in the text message, my hands clenched on the steering wheel. The pawnshop sat on the edge of town, squeezed between a payday loan office and a liquor store. Its neon sign buzzed faintly in the afternoon haze. Inside, the air smelled of metal and dust, of lives traded in for quick cash. Guitars hung on the walls, watches gleamed under glass, and behind the counter stood a man with tired eyes, the kind who had seen too many desperate faces. I slid my phone across the counter. You sent me this. He squinted at the photo of my ring, then nodded. Yeah, came in last week. Real beauty. Vintage, solid gold, worth every cent of the appraisal. My throat tightened. Who brought it in? He hesitated, glancing around as if the walls might be listening. Ma'am, we don't usually give out client information. Privacy laws, you know? I leaned forward, my voice lower now, sharp with a desperation I couldn't hide. That ring was stolen. It belonged to my husband, who's been dead 10 years. It's the only thing I had left of him. Please? Something in his face softened. He tapped at the computer, then pulled a slip of paper from a file. A pawn ticket. My eyes locked on the signature scrawled across the bottom. It wasn't Brandon's. It was hers. My daughter's handwriting, unmistakable, the same looping letters I had once taught her, the same hand that had written me birthday cards in crayon. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. My daughter, my flesh and blood, had signed away the last piece of her father. The man slid the ticket back toward me. She got $3,000 cash. Took less than 5 minutes. I folded the paper slowly, my hands trembling. Outside, the air felt heavier, as if the world itself knew a line had been crossed. When I pulled into the driveway that night, laughter drifted from the kitchen. My daughter's laugh, tangled with Brandon's. A sound that should have been comforting but now felt like a blade twisting. I sat in the car a long time, holding that pawn ticket, realizing that the fight I thought was against my son-in-law was, in truth, against the person I loved most in this world. And nothing breaks a mother's heart more than knowing her child has chosen betrayal over trust. I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the car with the pawn ticket pressed flat against my palm, as if it were burning a hole straight through my skin. There are moments in life when you know the ground beneath your family has shifted forever. That night, I felt it. When I finally opened the front door, the scent of garlic and butter wrapped around me. My daughter was at the stove, stirring pasta, humming softly to herself. Brandon sat at the table, a laptop open, his face lit by the glow of numbers and charts. It looked like any ordinary evening in any ordinary home. but the ticket in my hand said otherwise. I placed it on the table between us, the paper soft but heavy with betrayal. Do you recognize this? My daughter turned, her spoon still in hand. At first she frowned in confusion, then her eyes fell on the signature. Her lips parted. The wooden spoon clattered into the pot. Mom, I can explain. There's nothing to explain, I said, my voice steady but trembling underneath. You signed away your father's ring, the only piece of him I had left. Her face flushed, guilt spilling across it, but then, like a curtain drawn, her expression hardened. I did it for us, for me and Brandon, for our future. Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms folded, as if he'd been waiting for this performance. Mrs. Walsh, I told you, this is bigger than sentimental trinkets. That money is seed capital. It's going to multiply. Your daughter is thinking long term. She understands sacrifice. Sacrifice? The word cracked in my mouth like glass. I looked at her, my own flesh and blood. Sacrifice is giving up sleep so you can study late into the night. Sacrifice is taking two jobs so your child can go to college. Sacrifice is watching the man you love fade away and carrying that grief alone so your daughter doesn't have to. Sacrifice is not selling your dead father's ring for a scam. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't back down. It's not a scam. You don't understand, Mom. Brandon's company is going to change everything. You always told me Dad wanted me to live boldly, to build a future without fear. Well, this is me doing that. I'm investing in my life. I felt something in me splinter. No, I whispered. This isn't boldness, this is blindness. You're giving away pieces of yourself to him, to this illusion he's selling, and you don't even see it. Brandon's voice cut in, smooth and venomous. Margaret, with all due respect, maybe it's time you stopped holding her back. She's not a little girl anymore. She's a woman, my wife. She makes her own decisions. And frankly, if that ring was so important, why keep it in a box instead of passing it down to her? Doesn't she deserve her father's legacy more than a velvet drawer does? I turned to him sharply, my anger rising like heat from the stove. That ring was never about ownership. It was about memory, about love, and you've twisted it into nothing but currency. For a moment, silence fell. The only sound was pasta boiling over, hissing against the hot burner. My daughter rushed to turn off the stove, slamming the lid down harder than she needed to. When she turned back to me, her cheeks were wet with tears. I did it because I believe in him, she said, her voice breaking. Because he believes in me. You've been living in the past for so long, Mom. You can't expect me to do the same. I wanted to reach for her, to cradle her face like I did when she was 5 and thought monsters lived under her bed. But this monster was real, sitting right across the table, smiling at her devotion. I swallowed hard. Belief is one thing, betrayal is another. You didn't just pawn a ring, you pawned trust, you pawned your father's promise, and I don't know if that can ever be bought back. Her sob broke through the air, sharp and raw. She turned away, hiding her face in her hands. Brandon stood, slipped an arm around her shoulders, and guided her upstairs as if he were the hero of this story. He looked back once, his smirk daring me to try and break the spell. The house grew quiet. I sat alone at the table, staring at the pawn ticket, the ink of her signature still fresh in my mind. My daughter thought she was investing in her future, but all I could see was how carefully Brandon was writing her into his own script, line by line, until she disappeared. And I knew then that this wasn't just about a ring or even about money. It was about the soul of my family, and I wasn't about to let it be sold for scrap. Sleep had become impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my daughter's name scrawled on that pawn ticket, the looping letters of her handwriting like chains around my chest. By day, I moved through the house like a shadow, pretending life was ordinary, but inside I carried a storm. Brandon was careful, I'll give him that. He spoke in half-truths and vague promises, always painting a picture of some glittering future. To my daughter, it must have looked like ambition. To me, it looked like hunger, the kind that devours everything in its path. One Thursday night, as the clock ticked past midnight, I heard his voice floating up from the den. Low, urgent, different from the charming tone he used at the dinner table. I crept down the hallway, my bare feet silent against the carpet, and pressed myself against the wall near the door frame. Don't worry, he was saying into his phone. She's completely on board. The old woman doesn't matter, she'll fold soon enough. The pawn ticket was just the beginning. There's more where that came from. I felt my blood run cold. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end, then he chuckled softly. Yeah, the startup's perfect. No one questions blockchain. It's like magic to them. Money goes in dirty, comes out clean. By the time anyone notices, we'll be long gone. I pressed my hand to my mouth to stop the gasp from escaping. He leaned back in his chair, voice dropping lower, smooth as oil. Our next transfer clears Friday. If we keep scaling like this, we'll move 500,000 before the quarter ends. And Sarah, well, she's the best cover I could ask for. Sweet, loyal, and blind as a bat when it comes to her mother. My knees nearly buckled beneath me. My daughter wasn't just caught up in a bad business, she was being used as a shield for something criminal. I stumbled back up the stairs, every muscle in my body trembling. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark window. The reflection staring back at me was a woman who looked older than her years, but her eyes burned with something fierce. I thought of my husband, of his badge, of all the nights he had sat across from me and explained how criminals operated. They always believe they're smarter than everyone else. That arrogance will undo them, Maggie. You just have to pay attention. Well, I was paying attention now. The next morning, I watched Brandon slide into his routine, pouring coffee, checking his phone, kissing my daughter on the cheek before heading out with a briefcase full of lies. He looked untouchable, confident, certain of his path. But deep inside, I knew I had the beginnings of what I needed. Proof. Words overheard in the dark. Enough to start unraveling the net he had spun around my daughter. I wasn't ready to confront her yet, not without more. Not without something so undeniable that even love couldn't disguise it. So I made myself a quiet promise as I watched his car pull out of the driveway. I would follow him. I would watch. I would listen. And when the time came, I would be ready to cut the strings before he turned my daughter into nothing more than another pawn. For now, I kept my silence because silence is the best weapon when the enemy thinks you're deaf. And that night, as I lay awake listening to the walls creak, I realized something chilling. Brandon thought he was the spider, but he hadn't met the woman who would set fire to the web. By the time the weekend arrived, I knew I couldn't carry this burden alone. The walls of the house felt too small, the secrets pressing in on me from every corner. My daughter still moved about with blind devotion, laughing at Brandon's jokes, nodding at his talk of markets and opportunities. And I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, wondering how much time we had before the trap snapped shut. I thought of Frank, my husband, my anchor. He had faced men like Brandon before, men who dressed up greed and charm, who manipulated hearts as easily as numbers in a ledger. And Frank always had someone at his side, his partner, Detective Ray Collins. It had been years since I last spoke to Ray, but grief has a way of storing names like seeds, ready to bloom when you need them most. I found his number in an old address book tucked between recipes and unpaid bills. My fingers shook as I dialed, half afraid he wouldn't remember me. But the moment his voice came through, gravelly and warm, I felt a wave of relief. Maggie Walsh? Well, I'll be damned, it's been a long time. Too long, I said softly, then my throat tightened. Ray, I need help. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush me. He listened as I laid out the story. My daughter's betrayal, the pawned ring, Brandon's late-night phone calls, the whispers of laundering. Every word left a bitter taste in my mouth, but speaking them aloud made the danger feel real, undeniable. When I finished, there was a pause, then Ray exhaled sharply. Sounds like your son-in-law is playing a dangerous game, and he's dragging Sarah straight into it. Yes, I whispered. And she doesn't see it. She believes him, Ray, more than she believes me. That's how men like him work, he muttered. Charm, lies, pressure. Make the victim think the cage is a gift. I closed my eyes, pressing back tears. What do I do? You gather proof, he said firmly. The kind no one can deny. If what you overheard is true, then Brandon's not just greedy, he's criminal. And if he's laundering money, there are people above him who won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens their cut. You need to be careful. The weight of his words sank into me. Careful, silent, patient. It was the same advice Frank had lived by, the same lessons he'd tried to pass down. Ray's voice softened. You're not alone, Maggie. I may be retired, but I still know people in the department. I can point you in the right direction, but we need more than whispers. We need something solid. Then I'll get it, I said, surprising myself with the steel in my tone. Whatever it takes. We met the next day at a quiet diner on the edge of town, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone honey. When I walked in, Ray stood to greet me. He looked older, of course, gray hair, slower step, but his eyes still carried that sharpness, that readiness to see through lies. You look like hell, he said gently, sliding a cup of coffee toward me. I feel worse, I admitted. He chuckled. That's usually how it starts. Then his face turned serious. Listen, Maggie, this isn't just about catching him in a lie. It's about protecting Sarah. If he's involved in laundering, there's no telling what kind of people are watching your house, your accounts, your lives. You need to stay 2 steps ahead. I nodded, though fear curled tight in my stomach. How do I even begin? Ray leaned closer. Brandon's arrogant. Men like him always leave a trail, phone logs, bank transfers, careless messages. He thinks you're harmless. Use that, play the part, make him underestimate you. Meanwhile, I'll see what I can dig up on my end. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. It was small, fragile, but real hope. As I drove home that afternoon, the pawn ticket lay on the passenger seat beside me, like a scar on paper. My daughter's handwriting, Brandon's lies, the echoes of Frank's voice in my memory, they all pressed into me, heavy and unrelenting. But now I wasn't just a grieving widow, clutching at memories. I was a woman with a plan, and I would not let my daughter be devoured by the man she trusted most. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope above a canyon. One misstep, one word out of place, and Brandon would know I was watching. So I played my part carefully. I cooked dinners. I smiled when spoken to. I nodded when he talked about investors and opportunities. To him, I was the aging mother-in-law drifting further into irrelevance. But beneath that mask, I was taking notes, watching his every move. Ray and I spoke in brief phone calls, never too long, never at the same time of day. He warned me, patience is everything, Maggie. He'll slip, they always do. When he does, you need to be ready. It didn't take long. On a gray Wednesday morning, Brandon left earlier than usual, his suit pressed sharper than a blade. He kissed my daughter quickly at the door, muttering something about an investor lunch. But I saw the way his eyes flickered, the way he checked his watch twice before stepping outside. He wasn't going to lunch. He was going to business. I waited a few minutes, then slipped into my car and followed. My old sedan coughed as it pulled out of the driveway, but Brandon didn't notice. He was too focused on the road ahead, his phone pressed to his ear, his lips moving fast. He drove to the edge of the city, into a part of town where glass towers cast long shadows over worn-out streets. Finally, he pulled into a parking garage beneath a sleek office building with mirrored windows. From the outside, it looked legitimate, respectable even. But I'd learned long ago that appearances were the cheapest disguise. I parked 2 levels down and waited, watching his reflection in my side mirror as he strode confidently toward the elevators. Then I took a deep breath, grabbed the small recorder Ray had given me, and followed. The office suite was on the 12th floor, tucked behind a frosted glass door that read, Altura Capital Partners, the kind of name that sounded impressive but meant nothing. Through the glass, I could see a handful of men in tailored suits gathered around a polished table. Brandon was among them, shaking hands, his smile wide and false. I slipped inside quietly, pretending to be a client waiting for another office. No one paid me much attention. An older woman in a simple coat hardly looked like a threat. I took a seat in the lounge area near the conference room, close enough to hear muffled voices through the half-open door. At first it was jargon, words like crypto assets, offshore accounts, liquidity, but then the conversation shifted. Friday's transfer has to be clean, one of the men said. His voice was sharp, commanding. We can't risk another delay. Our partners overseas are watching closely. Brandon replied, his tone eager. It'll move through as planned. My wife's family money has already started seeding the account. By the time regulators look, it'll look like standard investment capital, nothing suspicious. My stomach clenched. He was using my daughter as cover, parading her innocence as proof of legitimacy. Another man spoke, lower, more dangerous. And the mother? There was a pause, then Brandon's voice, calm and confident. She's old, confused. I've got her under control. I pressed the recorder tighter in my hand, my heart pounding so loudly I worried they might hear it through the wall. The meeting lasted another 20 minutes, long enough for me to capture names, dates, and numbers, details that Ray insisted were the currency of justice. When Brandon finally emerged, adjusting his tie and grinning like a king who'd conquered new land, I kept my head down, pretending to flip through a magazine. He didn't even glance at me. By the time I made it back to my car, my knees were trembling. But when I pressed play on the recorder, the voices spilled out clear and sharp. Proof, undeniable proof. That evening I met Ray at the same diner. The recorder sat between us like a loaded weapon. He listened carefully, nodding, his jaw tightening with every passing minute. "This is it," he said finally. "This is what we needed. He's not just playing at being a businessman. He's laundering money for organized crime, and he's dragging your daughter right into the fire." My hands shook as I sipped my coffee. "What happens now?" Ray leaned forward, his eyes steady on mine. "Now, Maggie, we set the trap. He thinks you're harmless. Let's make that mistake his undoing." For the first time since my ring disappeared, I felt the balance of power shift. Brandon thought he was building an empire, but he had no idea the foundation was already cracking beneath him, and I would be the one to bring it down. The days that followed were unbearable, not because I doubted what I had heard, but because I had to keep it locked inside. Every moment with my daughter felt like standing on a cliff edge, knowing she couldn't see the drop beneath her feet. She moved through the house in a haze of hope, making plans with Brandon, speaking about their future as if it were already carved in stone. I watched her hum as she folded laundry, watched her eyes light up when Brandon mentioned investors or returns. She was so certain of him, too certain, but little cracks were beginning to show. One evening she came home from work early, shoulders slumped, exhaustion dragging her steps. She asked Brandon about the bills, why the electricity hadn't been paid, why her paycheck seemed to vanish so quickly. His answer was a smile, a hand on her arm, and a cascade of jargon about short-term liquidity and long-term gain. I saw her hesitate, just for a moment, a pause in her blind devotion. Later that night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her pacing the hallway, whispering on the phone to a friend. "He says everything's fine," she murmured, her voice tight with worry. "But sometimes I feel like I don't know where the money's going, or even where he's going." It was the first time I'd heard doubt in her voice. The next morning, I made her coffee the way I always did, hot, black, the way she liked it since college. She sat across from me, her hair pulled back, her eyes distant. "You've been quiet," I said softly. She forced a smile. "Just tired." I leaned forward. "Tired doesn't make your hands shake." Her eyes widened, then dropped to the table. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking clock on the wall. Finally, she whispered, "Do you ever wonder if Dad would have liked him?" The question pierced me. My husband, the man who could read a liar in a heartbeat, would have seen straight through Brandon. "I think," I said carefully, "your father would have wanted you to feel safe, truly safe." She didn't answer, but I saw the tears glistening at the corners of her eyes before she stood and walked away. That night, Brandon returned late, his suit rumpled, his voice loud with false cheer. "Big day tomorrow," he announced, kissing my daughter on the cheek. "We're meeting with serious investors. Game-changing money." My daughter smiled faintly, but her eyes flickered toward me. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him with devotion. She was looking at me, searching. I knew then that the moment was near. The doubt had started to grow inside her. She needed truth, not whispers. So after Brandon left the room, I followed her upstairs. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. The same hands that had once held crayons, that had once reached for mine in crowded stores, that had signed away my ring. I sat beside her quietly. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then I reached into my purse and placed the recorder on the nightstand. Her eyes darted to it. "What's that?" "Proof," I said simply. "Proof of who your husband really is. Proof of what he's doing. Proof of what he's dragging you into." She shook her head quickly. "No, no, he wouldn't," but I pressed the button. Brandon's voice filled the room, calm and confident, speaking about dirty money, about using her as cover, about how the old woman doesn't matter. I watched her face pale, watched the hope drain from her eyes, watched her hands tremble as she covered her mouth. "Stop it," she whispered. Please stop. I did. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. She looked at me then, her eyes red, her voice breaking. Mom, what have I done? I reached for her hand, squeezing it tight. You believed in love, that's not a crime, but now you have to believe in truth, that's the only way out. She buried her face in my shoulder, her sobs raw and desperate. For the first time, I felt her grip tighten, not on the dream Brandon had spun, but on me. On us, on family. And I knew the glass was breaking. The illusion was shattering. All that was left was to bring it crashing down completely. The morning of the sting felt like standing at the edge of a storm. Brandon left the house humming, straightening his tie, his confidence radiating like armor. He believed it was the day his empire would expand, the day his name would be written among the men who commanded wealth and power. He had no idea it would be the day his empire collapsed. Ray and his contacts had arranged everything. I played my role, quiet, compliant, the fading mother-in-law who barely understood the details of his big deals. Brandon barely glanced at me as he left, too wrapped up in the promise of easy riches. But at the investors' meeting, the air shifted. The men he thought were allies revealed themselves as law enforcement. Voices turned sharp, badges flashed, and Brandon's smooth tongue faltered for the first time. He tried to charm, then to argue, then to deny. But the evidence spoke louder. The recordings, the accounts, the paper trail of every lie he'd spun. Back at the house, when they led him away in handcuffs, my daughter stood in the doorway, tears streaming silently down her face. He called her name, desperate, but she did not answer. She only clutched my arm as though holding on to something real for the first time in months. In the days that followed, the investigation unraveled more than we'd imagined. The pawnshop, the fake company, the offshore accounts, all threads in a web of greed and deception. But through it all, there was one small piece of redemption. The pawnshop owner, who had kept my husband's ring aside, returned it to me with quiet respect. When I slipped it back onto my finger, it was as if my husband's hand closed around mine again. Not because gold has power, but because love does. My daughter and I sat together that evening, the ring glinting softly in the lamplight between us. She wept as she whispered apologies, her voice raw with shame. I held her close and told her what every mother eventually tells her child, that mistakes can wound, but they do not define us. That love, if held tightly enough, can survive even betrayal. We would rebuild together. And now, as I sit here telling you this story, I hold my husband's promise on my hand and my daughter's promise in my heart. Not all endings are perfect, but some are enough. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting my story find a place in your home tonight. I wish you health, peace, and above all, the kind of family that holds together through storms. May your loved ones be your safe place, and may you never forget that even in the darkest hour, love can still bring you home. Stay well, stay hopeful, and hold your family close.